Hello, my name is Tinu Cornish and I am Senior Training and Learning Advisor for ECU. Today we're going to be talking to and hearing from Professor Aneez Esmail about the Race Equality Charter and also the Workforce Race Equality Scheme and academia and the promotion of race equality.
My name is Aneez Esmail. I'm a Professor of General Practice, currently working at the University of Manchester, where I've been really for the last 25 years. Until about 4 years ago, I was in charge of the whole area around social responsibility, which included race equality. So we're a bit unusual in Manchester in that we were one of the first institutions to sort of make this a very important part of what we were trying to do. And I think I was probably the first person working in senior management who had responsibility for equality and diversity.
And I also know that you have had a major role to play in terms of setting up the Workforce Rate Equality Scheme that's been rolled out across the NHS.
Yes, I worked together with my colleague Roger Klein to persuade the Chief Executive of the NHS, Simon Stevens, that this is something that the NHS really had to take on board, because we were able to show that although the NHS, and it is the largest employer in the UK, that's why it's so important, had made significant progress around race equality, it was moving backwards. And this was a worry to lots of people, really. So the point about the race equality standard was unusually, it is said that we are now going to mandate certain standards. And what does that mean for the NHS? And I felt very strongly about this. You see, put it into context, I said it's the largest employer, but nearly a third of its workforce, so unusually, it has a much higher proportion of ethnic minorities working in it than other public institutions. Why? Because ethnic minorities are overrepresented, for example, in the medical professions, pharmacy, dentistry, nursing. So it's a big employer of ethnic minorities, and more importantly, skilled ethnic minorities. Yet when you look at the NHS, you see very few people at the senior levels.
Yes.
And in a way mimics the higher education sector. So, I think that there might be, two vice-chancellors, or they call themselves presidents now, who are ethnic minorities. And this is quite incredible, really. You look at a country like the UK, when 12% of its population are ethnic minorities. You look at areas like the NHS, where a third of the doctors are ethnic minorities, and then you look at the university sector, and you can say that out of 192, I don't know how many universities, you have 2 ethnic minorities, and usually in very small colleges. Not only look at the presidents, but look at the level below that, at the pro-vice-chancellors or the vice-presidents, and again, they're very, very few. And it doesn't at all reflect the number of people in academia. So if you take the number of people who are lecturers, for example, which is not a bad one to look at. So how many people are making academia as their career choice? And you'll find it's probably about 17 to 20% who are ethnic minorities. Yet look at the top, and it's nowhere near that proportion. I mean, I was just joking in Manchester as a professor that say 30% of staff in the NHS are doctors like me. You look at university professors, it's 3%.
Yes.
Okay, so,
yes.
And I always used to enjoy it, quite a privileged position to be sometimes. Who would talk about privilege of 3%?
Yes.
But when you had these important functions,
Yes.
I always got on the top table because there was
there's only one of you.
One of me,
Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
that's right, yes, so it's a bit, but that's the reality of it.
Yes.
And so it shows you the mountain we have to climb, really. And what we said to Simon Stevens in the NHS was, look, he says that it just no longer is acceptable that this can be allowed to continue, because what is the impact of something like that? And the impact is this, that people in the end say that why should I bother? Why should I excel individually, because I'll never be recognised, and we're all human beings, we want recognition, and so that's a big turn off. I'm not saying we all want to be administrators, but the way universities work in the hierarchy, you move up, and as you move up, that's when you get the position and the power and the respect. And that's what people want frequently. And you don't get that, you see. So it's important from that point of view. So in a way, you don't get you don't recognise the potential of your staff if you don't acknowledge them and people need to see that. Secondly, the universities like to make a big deal of the fact that they're world-class institutions, you know. Well, quite frankly, the world is not white.
Yes.
And if people want to come and work in here, and I know this from my colleagues who work in India, who work in America, they look at your body and say, well, you know, why should I bother to go there? And I do it myself. I look at institutions and I think, well, you know, do they recognize ethnic minorities in senior positions? And when they do, I look at it more positively. I said, actually, I wouldn't mind working there because I can see that when an institution is able to appoint senior people in its senior management positions, I think minorities, it does. You look at it and you say, actually, I could get there as well then. And when it's the opposite, you think, well, I'm not going to bother. And I think that, so as work-class institutions, without a doubt, in this international market, people will look at equality in a very different way if you can show that you actually practice it. And then, of course, it reflects how well you nurture your staff. You know,
Yes.
if you nurture your staff, they will rise up, and you need to be able to show that. So again, it's a good selling point in terms of workforce development, professional development, that to say, look, come here. And this was actually the big sell in Manchester. The person who appointed me to my role, Alan Gilbert, who sadly died about 4 years ago, you know, used to say this, is that I want Manchester to be a world-class institution. I want to attract the best people here. And in order to do that, I need to be able to show that we will nurture all talent from wherever in the world, and whoever you are. And that was a huge selling point for
Yes.
it. And it can be for the universities
Yes.
if they understand this.
Yes. Yes, people want to feel that if they come, they're going to be able to flourish, they're going to be
Absolutely.
able to rise to their full potential. So I think, like the Workforce Race Equality Scheme, the Race Equality Charter really starts by asking institutions to look at data so they can identify where BME staff and students are progressing, where there are key issues that they need to prioritise addressing. But I also think there's some fundamental differences between the two schemes, one of which is this issue of the Workforce Race Equality Scheme is not a voluntary scheme like the REC is, it's mandatory. Can you say why you decided to go down that route and why you feel it's so important?
Well, it's to do with really where we are at the moment in terms of race equality. Well, you can look at equality generally, okay? So let me give you an example. I have been working in academia now for 25 years. And there's no doubt that progress is being made. So if I look at the number of black professors like me who are appointed, the numbers have gone up. There's many more people who are appearing in media who are black historians, professors, people like that. So clearly progress is made. I can't sit back and say we've made no progress,
No.
okay? The reality it is still not sufficient. Okay, and this applies to gender equality as well. You know, we turn around and say, oh, fantastic, you know, 20% of professors are women now in Manchester. Well, actually, it should be 40%.
Yes,
you know?
yes.
So let's not say that things are fantastic and everything's going to be all right. And quite frankly, I don't think it's acceptable to wait another 20 years. So the challenge is, how do we get in a much faster pace of development? Because we are living in a world which demands things change quickly. People are not prepared to wait. Certainly my children, why should they
Yes.
wait 20 years before things change so they can become
Yes.
senior professors like me? So the challenge is, how do we do this? And it must depend on the organisation. You see, the NHS is a very monolithic organisation. It is top-down control. And in those situations, if NHS England says something, on the whole, it happens.
Okay, yeah.
So you have that situation. And we went for mandate and made things mandatory because we had been trying lots of initiatives, and they start, and then the government changes or austerity happens, and it goes on the back burner.
Yes.
And this is, you know, stop, start, stop, start. So it's not that there's no commitment, but how do you ensure that things change and continue to change and continue to progress? And we came to the conclusion, and this was an academic conclusion based on reviewing the literature, where we got to, what was the example of other countries, and we realized certain things. That firstly, no matter how much you do around training and around things like unconscious bias training and other things, policy procedures, you only get so far. If you want to make that leap beyond the the sort of baseline.
Yes.
You have to do something different. And I know one of the things that really influenced me in convincing Simon Stevens about what we should do was actually based on an example that was used in higher education when Dame Sally Davis, the Chief Medical Officer, said that that in future they were going to use the £2 billion pounds a year annual funding that they give to the NHS for doing research, which is primarily carried out in academic institutions. In order to even apply for that grant, you had to prove that you were actually making progress around gender equality.
Yes.
Because, you know, the reality is that it comes back to the same argument. We don't get the talent we need if you deny half the workforce the opportunities.
Yes.
All right? So if you want the best biomedicine, the best technology, the best physiology, you need to encourage everyone else. And if women are systematically discriminated against, you're not going to get the best talent. So she made the fair point, which interestingly was signed off by ministers in the last coalition government, that said, we as a public institution give away £2 billion a year, £2 billion pounds a year in research funding, and surely we can demand and ask certain things.
Yes.
And the simple thing is that we want evidence. It wasn't just we want policies. We want evidence that you actually can make sure that women in your organizations can rise to the top. And what is that evidence based on? It's based on looking at things like outcomes from recruitment, promotions processes, all the things that someone like me has been arguing for a long, long time. But this time, they were going to attach real money to it. And what Dame Sally said was that you can't even apply for funding if you don't get a basic minimum requirement. And they chose the Athena Swan Charter, which I know the Race Equality Charter is closely modelled on. And what does the Athena Swan Charter do? It is different in that it actually asks for outcomes. It's no good saying I have best policies in the world. It's no good saying that we really think it's important, that we have senior management buy into it. What the fundamental thing that the Athena Swan did was to say that you only get the highest achievement when you show a change in outcomes. So we want to see the change in women getting to the senior management, to promotion, to recruitment, and all those things. And I think that the Race Equality Charter is good in that respect as well. And I use my institution as an example. I mean, I said to you that we were the first institution that appointed a senior academic as lead for equality and diversity, a Russell Group institution at that. And we did a lot of stuff around policy and procedures. And you know, I mean, I was given a huge amount of power and influence to look at many, many areas. But in the end, I think it's right that I should be judged on outcomes.
Yes.
And not just on the things that we were able to put in place. And the reality is that I consider Manchester one of the leading institutions in terms of what it's trying to do around race equality and gender equality, and yet we can only achieve a bronze in race,
yes.
And that's quite right, because
yes.
in the end we should be judged on our outcomes.
Yes.
We've achieved Athena Silver status,
yes.
Because we're doing a lot better around women. But you know, we've been doing issues around gender equality for a lot longer. So I think it's right, and I think that, you know, it's important that institutions are judged, and they're judged with high standards. And it's not just about procedures and policies and training, it's about, in the end, on what you achieve through outcomes.
Yes, that's right. So for a bronze, you can show that you've got a firm foundation, you've got a really good action plan, but you're not going to get silver unless you can actually demonstrate that that plan has been rolled out and it's actually leading to impact outcomes, as you're suggesting. At the present, we haven't got a strong stick.
Yeah.
We haven't got such a clear-cut business case as was provided by Sally Davis. So if you were sort of talking to senior managers in academia, what would you say to them is in it for them? What are they going to get out of it? You've talked about it being part of what you need to be a world-class university, but what would you suggest are the other gains for them of actually becoming an inclusive organisation through implementing something like the Race Equality Charter.
I mean, look, the business case, I think no one would question anymore. You can't, because it's to do with your workforce. If you look at universities, 60-70% of our income spent on the staff. It is our most important resource of all. And all we are trying to get out the best research, the best teaching, the best learning environment. And that can only come from a student body which is diverse, that's a given. And I know the Race Equality Chart doesn't always cover that, but it might cover processes around how we select.
We definitely cover students.
Well,
yes,
that's right.
yeah.
Well, that's good. But the staff, and let's talk about staff, are the most important resource you have. And it's just a no-brainer in my mind that if you're going to succeed as an institution, then you have to be able to show that all your talent can be supported and can achieve its ambitions, that the staff can achieve their ambitions, and in order to do that, you need to be very, very aware of issues around diversity. I think it's, people sort of underestimate the value, but look, in the end, as an academic researcher, I want recognition for what I do. I know I have to do my part. I have to get the grants, I have to write the papers and so on, but I also want something back again for it. I'm a human being like anyone else. I like the fact that I get credit. I like the fact that people look to me and quote my research and so on. And in a way, my institution, my employer needs to acknowledge that and recognize that. Because if I'm not recognized, then in the end, it just wears me down.
Yes.
And I just say, well, why should I bother? And I see this so often, really. And people underestimate this. And I see it because I used to be in a senior management role, and people used to come and talk to me about it and say, oh, it's all very well, Aneez, you're doing all these things, but look, we still aren't changing. Look what happened here. Look, this person is really good. Why didn't they get promoted, Look at that department. It's all white managers. And these things have an impact. And I think one of the problems is that senior managers sometimes, they may, I say this to people, we work in higher education and we're all very clever people.
Yes.
Yeah? No, it's true, isn't it?
No, I know.
And so, you can't say that people don't recognize the importance
yes.
of it. But what they don't frequently acknowledge is actually the hurdle that they have to overcome in order to get there, because they sort of have this notion that, well, if you're clever, you'll get there. Well, it's not the case.
Yes.
It's not the case, because there are enough clever people from all walks of life, and I just refuse to accept that we don't have the women and the ethnic minorities who can't achieve the top positions. And so what is holding them back, unfortunately, are these barriers, and we put names to them, and they're called inequality, they're called discrimination, they're called racism, they're called sexism. These are the things that hold people back, and we have to acknowledge that. And so the challenge is, how are we going to fight that? And I don't mind when people want to use words like racism or sexism or gender inequality, because that is the lived experience of people.
Yes.
And let's acknowledge that. It's not a problem for the women that they don't get promoted. It's a problem for the institution. It's not my problem that I don't get promoted. Yes, if I'm not doing my work, then fine. But the reality is that I never see, or very rarely, I'm saying never, in medicine we say never say
yes.
never, but I very rarely see people not succeeding when they have not been nurtured and supported and given the means to excel themselves.
Yes.
And that is a reality, and that's what we've got to try and do.
So one of the challenges I think we face is actually getting the majority group, the mainstream, to actually acknowledge that these issues and problems are also their problems. And so over the past year, we've been trying to ECU has been rolling out a different approach to race equality training, where we're actually bringing in the notion of white privilege, and actually not lecturing people, not talking at people, but setting up experiential exercises so people can, in their gut, start to feel how they may have been racially advantaged, and that's helping people to take a different perspective on this and take some ownership. So I don't know whether how to improve race equality training or successful race equality training is something that you have been involved with or encountered or have a view on, it'd be interesting to hear.
So look, I think, of course, the reality is there's no one answer to any of this. Okay, no. So if you ask me about race equality training, it's come a long way. So when I first started it, I remember Manchester lost a signature race equality case. You know, a black professor successfully, well, he wasn't a professor then, he took the university to an industrial tribunal, and Manchester was found to discriminate against him. It was over 15 years ago now, but very, very important. So of course, you know, Manchester was told that you can no longer turn around and say, well, you know, we didn't know, or we didn't, you know, didn't understand what was happening.
Yes.
So the response was given very firmly back to Manchester. And what they did is they made all their staff undergo race equality training, and it was a terrible thing. You know?
Yes.
And people moaned about it and they complained about it. But you know, that's what we understood at that time.
Yes.
And as far as the university was concerned, just do it, and then you can't complain that you didn't know. All right? But of course, we've got much better at doing that now. So the training is much better. I've used examples where we've used actors in role play with senior managers, very effective. So I think we've learned a lot more about that, you know. We work together with psychologists, with trainers and others to help us work out how best to. So it's an important component, but it's not the only component.
Yes.
And similarly, I think that the acknowledgement of unconscious bias training and understanding the issue about privilege is important. So I think that's another component which frequently we didn't talk enough about, and that's important. And I remember going to a training that I was organised in Manchester, and I actually got someone from the senior civil service to come and talk to us, because they'd done some work around this in the late 90s. And she pointed out that that was quite an eye-opener for the senior managers. You know, suddenly they began to understand, you know, their privilege in a sense, and their unconscious bias and how it worked. And she said it was transformative.
Right,
all right?
Great.
So,
yes.
so I do see its value, but the third component of it, I said training you can't ignore, it's there, but it won't make the big leap that you want. Unconscious bias training is important, but again, it won't make the leap you want. But I think the thing that will make the leap is actually looking at outcomes. And I give the example, once again, of the National Institute of Health Research and what they did with thinner swab. You see, the point is that you won't even get a look in on applying for this funding unless you can show you improve things. My argument is this in terms of higher education. We don't have this monolithic NHS structure where the chief executive says something and tomorrow everyone will be following on the whole what happens, okay? Or the minister sneezes and everyone, you know, stands to attention at the other end.
We wish.
You wish, okay?
Yes.
So universities pride themselves on being autonomous, although they're public institutions.
Yes.
The point is that they get a huge amount of public funding, all right? And the research councils are a big funder of research in universities. And I think, quite frankly, in this day and age, it is about time that they use that muscle they have to demand certain things. So it's interesting that if the NIHR, which gives away £2 billion of research funding, and has found that it's worked, no one's complained and said how awful it is and they can't do their research simply because you're asking me to prove that I can actually, you know, support women academics and women researchers in achieving their aims.
Yes.
They all do it. They all do it now. All right. So now, yet have the research councils done it? No, they're still talking about it. You know,
yes.
Academia loves talking, doesn't it? You know, and my argument is, look, the research councils give billions of pounds of research funding every year to public institutions. It's public money. The public has a right to say, to demand that the people who receive that actually fulfill some basic requirements. And that's where I think that has to happen in higher education. So do all those things, you know, and of course I wouldn't say they're easy, but in a way we can do something about that quite quickly.
Yes.
The outcomes, you know, we'll sit down and then, you know, all these senior academics will turn around and go, oh, you know, well, I'm not sure, and oh, it's difficult, and it's not really like that. And the reason is, of course, they don't like it because it means something. Yeah?
Yes.
They'll sit and go to a training thing, they'll moan about it, you know. But in the end, when their grant will depend on whether they can show that their institution is fulfilling some basic requirements, and that's what they are, their basic requirements. What are we saying? Look at Manchester, when we were making the change. We said that, you know, when we reviewed annually promotions rounds, we would look and say, well, why were no women promoted that year in that
yes.
faculty? What's wrong with asking that question? You know, and we look at the ethnic minority data and saying, well, why were there no, I mean, look, you have 20 senior lecturers in that department.
Yes.
So why was not a single one brought forward. And you know what? It's not only this year, you did it for the last 3 years. So that's reasonable to ask. And of course, you know, when we asked those questions, people went back and said, oh, you know, yeah, actually, she was very good. But you know what happened is, you know, we didn't give her the chance to do X, Y, and Z. Let's make sure that happens. And you know, when you focus your mind, as my mentor, Alan Gildy, used to say, you know, ask the questions. And it's a very powerful way of doing it. Ask the questions and say, why not? And then you go back and you say, and if it happens a second time around, you say, well, actually, next year, I'm not going to give you your pay rise as a senior manager if you don't do something about it. And does that concentrate minds?
Yes, that certainly motivates. So that so that people's performance-rated pay is related to their diversity.
So when he used to sit down with his senior management team, he would ask them, you know, well, we said we're going to do this, so what's happening now? Now, Manchester doesn't have performance-rated pay. Of course, no one in academia admits to that, but they have performance management, okay, at senior levels. And they will sit down with their president or their vice president if they're a head of department, and that is part of that judgment, and quite rightly so. You know, and it happens. So we review our data, and year on year, targets are set for senior managers, and one of those must be an equality target, because that's where you make progress.
I mean, I think one of the strengths of the Race Equality Charter for academia is that actually data is their bread and butter. And what we're saying is use your own data to examine your bias blind spots to help you identify where things are going wrong. And develop some hypotheses about what's causing the issues or the blockages, and then do something about it.
Absolutely, and do something about it is a critical thing, isn't it?
Yes,
you know what?
It builds on their strengths.
Absolutely, but you know what? The data, you know, it's like the NHS. You know, it's just stunning actually that they collect a huge amount of data, but you know what? They never looked at it.
No.
This is what the res does. It says, we don't need any more work, but here's your data. Did you know? And they look at it and say, oh, we never knew that. And their boards would suddenly come up and says, you know, why is that? It says, where did you get the data from? It says, on your website, you know, in the stuff you collect. And the same thing applies to universities. You know, HESA makes us collect tons and tons of data. And do we use it as a management tool? And the answer is no, we don't. And, you know, so this is not more work for people. It's actually saying, we have it, now use your brains and analyze it, and actually people like the ECU help them tremendously in understanding it, and then do something about it. And that's the change that we have to make, really. It's not more work for people.
They've been collecting this data since 1994.
It's so much, you know, I mean, it's so much. And one of my early pieces of work was in 1993, and we actually asked the equivalent of the medical school councils then, can we have the data on medical school admissions? And you know what they said to us? No, you can't have it. Why? Because it's private. I said, I beg your pardon, why do you collect it? I mean, the long and short of it is we forced them to give us the data. And then we analysed it by who gets medical school. And we showed them that, you know, not only are ethnic minorities hugely disadvantaged, but certain groups of ethnic minorities are very disadvantaged. And in fairness to them, they began to, by looking at the data, said, actually, we do admit that we have a problem. You know, and it's complicated, but you know, it's not that we lack the analytical power to do this. We do have that. Where we do is lack the will to make the change that makes a difference.
So this is one of the areas that's up for discussion at the moment, is bringing in an adapted version of the Race Equality Charter for medical schools and allied health professionals in particular, to try it, because there's a feeling that progress hasn't been made, and that some of the same issues that BME medical staff and so on were experiencing when you were first looking at the data, they're still experiencing now, and that change hasn't happened.
Yeah, but you see, it's interesting, you see, so if you look at, let's look at you talk about medical school, so let me use a wide definition of medicine. So I'll include in that nursing, pharmacy, dentistry, and medicine, and some of the other physiotherapy and others, okay? And what you find is a bit like the NHS, you know, there's huge differences within the different bodies. So it's quite fascinating. People will be surprised to know that ambulance trusts in the NHS are virtually all white male institutions, you know? And they have a terrible record on equality and race discrimination, all right? So even within the NHS there are pockets, and we talked about senior managers. So let's look at medical schools. So what's interesting about that, if you look at Manchester, nearly 40% of graduates, people graduating are ethnic minorities. So you could look at that and say, sorted.
Yes.
You know? What's the big deal? Dentistry, it's 60%. You look at pharmacy, it might be 70% of ethnic minorities. And now that's, you know, when I tell you that 12% of the population is ethnic minorities, you think, wow, isn't that fantastic? But you've got to go beyond that now. You've got to say, all right, so let's look at who's going into a clinical academic teaching in higher education. And suddenly you'll find that the numbers drop considerably. So why is that a problem? How many PhDs are coming out of nursing and medicine? And that's really important. And what you're finding is that people don't necessarily choose academic career paths. So you ask them why. They said, why should I bother? I never can become a professor. Where are the professors to show me?
Yes.
All right?
Yes.
So people are making these judgments all the time.
Yes.
All right? So you need to look at that. And I think that the point about medicine broadly, so medical schools who cover all these different specialisms, is they're quite right to look at it, you know, because in a way it's important that a society not only do we reflect the people we serve, but also we nurture that talent, you know. Society wants the best doctors.
Yes.
They want the best doctors to go into academic teaching and learning and research. And we need to show that we can do that. And I've seen wonderful examples in the United States where they have a lot more PhDs coming from ethnic minorities. They have programs defined, and we don't have them here. We don't have them here.
Can you give me an example?
Well, so for example, I spent a year as a visiting fellow at Harvard in the United States in the late 90s, and I went to a program that Harvard organized, funded from a private foundation, but it was to encourage African Americans and Native Americans to go into PhD studies. So what they would do is that they would not only just provide the funding, but they would say to medical schools like Harvard, you identify early on the people who you think can progress to the next stage.
Yes.
What do they need? Typically they need a master's in order to do that.
Yes.
So look, you identify the people, we'll fund the master's program.
Fantastic.
Yeah. To get PhD programs, they're very, very competitive. But look,
Yes.
we recognise not enough black, so we'll help fund that.
Yes.
You provide the training, and it's working. It's working. Now look at the news now.
Yes.
Look at local news. Look at the BBC. You will see a range on all the channels. How did that come about? I'll tell you how it came
Because
about.
they've had these
Absolutely. They had these programs and internships and mentoring, and you're seeing that effect now. It didn't happen because people just sat there and said,
No.
"Oh, it's terrible."
No.
Okay, so there was a policy that actually tended to do that. So I remember talking to the BBC when I was doing my research on it, and they said, you know what, we had no sound engineers that were women, and people say, oh well, what do women know about sound engineers? You know, I'm sitting in a room where 3 women are filming me and talking. You know, I mean, the point is, isn't it? Is that this is simply a reflection of practices that just perpetuate themselves. So the BBC had a program to train women sound engineers. And you know what? Whenever I do filming with the BBC now, frequently there'll be a woman who's the sound engineer. And that didn't come about, again, by just, you know, rubbing their chin and saying, oh, it's not possible. So you know, we can't turn around and say that, oh, well, black people don't want to do PhDs. Why? You know, I have 2 sons who want to do PhDs. You know, so it's just a nonsense. They have the same aspirations as anyone else.
And in fact, often more aspiration.
More
actually.
aspiration. And yet it isn't always fulfilled, you know.
Yes.
And the end result is this country's losing out on talent because of
Yes.
that.